All right, so you've probably heard this claim before, right? It comes up all the time when people talk about the book of Genesis, that the flood story, Noah and the ark, is just a copy, a ripoff of older, more ancient myths from Mesopotamia. And you know what? When you first look at the evidence, you can totally see why people say that. The case for plagiarism looks pretty strong.
I mean, just look at this. The parallels are honestly kind of shocking. In both stories, a hero gets a divine warning about a world-ending flood. He's told to build a massive boat. He saves his family, he saves the animals, the boat lands on a mountain, and the first thing he does when he gets out is offer a sacrifice. The plot points line up so neatly, it feels like an open and shut case.
So is that it? Is that the whole story? Did the biblical authors just take a popular story from their neighbors and, swap out the names? Well, this is where it gets so much more interesting, because the answer isn't that simple. To really get what's going on, you have to look at the details of the original stories.
To understand what the book of Genesis is doing, we first have to understand the world it was speaking to. We have to dive into the Mesopotamian flood myths, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, and ask a really basic question. Why did their gods decide to destroy the world in the first place?
You heard that right. It wasn't because of some deep moral failing or rampant evil. Nope. The main reason the gods sent the flood was because humanity had gotten too big, and all our noise was bugging the head god, Enlil. He just couldn't get a good night's sleep.
And look, this isn't my interpretation. This is a direct quote from one of those ancient texts, the Atrahasis epic. The most powerful gods in the world decided to commit global genocide because they were annoyed. This isn't a story about divine justice, it's about divine irritation.
Okay, so you would think these gods would at least be in command of the chaos that created, right? Not at all. When the flood actually hits, the story says the gods themselves completely freak out. They're terrified of the very storm they unleashed.
This image is just stunning. These supposedly all-powerful deities are described as cowering like dogs against a wall. They're not sovereign, they're not in control, they started something they couldn't handle, and now they're hiding from it. This is a huge clue to the worldview Genesis is arguing against.
And maybe the most pathetic part comes after the flood is over. When the hero, Utnapishtim, finally makes a sacrifice, what do the gods do? Well, see, they depended on humans for their food. So when they smell that barbecue, they're starving, and they literally swarm the altar like flies. So the picture we get is of gods who are petty, easily annoyed, weak, and desperately dependent on people.
Okay, so hold that picture in your mind, the scared, hungry, fly-like gods. Now, what if the author of Genesis knew that story forwards and backwards? And what if they used that familiar story not to copy it, but to completely tear it down? This isn't just borrowing, it's a takedown. It's what you might call theological warfare.
There's a formal name for this technique, polemical theology. It was actually a pretty common literary strategy in the ancient world. The idea is, you take a famous story that everybody knows, you keep the basic outline, but you change all the most important details to make a powerful argument against the original story's worldview.
To put it in today's terms, think of it like a diss track in music. The biblical author takes the beat and the melody that everyone recognizes, but then writes completely new, scathing lyrics to show why the original version is all wrong. It's an intentional, direct challenge.
So a polemic is the opposite of lazy copying. It's an aggressive move. It's interactive because it engages with the other culture's story. It's critical because its whole point is to expose flaws. And most of all, it's intentional. The entire reason for doing it is to draw a bright, bold line in the sand and show how your worldview is completely different.
So, with this diss track idea in our heads, let's go back and look at the Genesis flood story one more time. Because all those similarities we saw at the beginning, they suddenly don't look like plagiarism anymore. They look like the setup for a theological knockout punch. This chart really lays it all out. Look at the differences. In the Mesopotamian myths, you have many gods who are flawed and panicky. In Genesis, you have one God who is sovereign and in total control. The motive for the flood goes from being annoyed about noise to a serious moral judgment on evil. The hero isn't saved by some secret trick from a lesser god, he's chosen because of his righteousness. And the aftermath? Instead of hungry gods who regret the whole thing, you have the God of the universe making a promise, a covenant with all of humanity. And this, right here, is the absolute heart of the argument. The why behind the flood is turned completely on its head. It goes from the selfish whim of an annoyed deity to the just action of a moral creator.
The author uses the same event, a flood, to paint two completely opposite pictures of what God is like.
Remember those gods cowering like dogs? Compare that to the God of Genesis. He's the one who initiates the flood. He's in control during the flood. The text even says he's the one who personally shuts the door on the ark. There's no fear, no panic, no regret. The entire point is to show that this God is totally sovereign over his creation. That is the polemic.
And the argument doesn't stop with God. It extends to us. In the Mesopotamian stories, humans are basically an afterthought. We were created to be slaves, to do the grunt work the gods didn't want to do. But Genesis flips that completely. It says humanity is the crown of creation, made in the very image of God, with inherent dignity and purpose. So the story is correcting the view of God and the view of humanity.
So what's the verdict here? We've seen the similarities on the surface, but we've also dug down into the deep theological differences in the original myths and how Genesis responds. And the conclusion, I think, becomes pretty clear.
The author of Genesis isn't being unoriginal. They're being a brilliant communicator. They are taking a famous story that everyone in their culture would have known, and they're using it to make a radical, point-by-point argument for a completely different reality. They're basically saying, hey, you know that story about the flood? Let me tell you what really happened and what it really means about God and about you.
Old Testament scholar Bruce Waltke puts it perfectly. He says the biblical authors stripped the pagan stories of their mythology, then infused them with their understanding of God. And in doing so, they refuted the original pagan myths. It's a deliberate process: strip, infuse, and refute. The goal isn't just to retell a story, it's to take it apart and rebuild it into a powerful statement of truth.
So what's the big takeaway from all this? First, Genesis isn't a passive borrower. It's an active debater, engaging in the big ideas of its time. It's making a powerful case for a single moral God in a world full of flawed, petty deities. And this shows us just how sophisticated and intentional ancient literature can be. Once you see this strategy, it really changes how you read not just Genesis, but a lot of the ancient world.
And that kind of leaves us with a final, fascinating question to think about. If the flood story is a polemic, what other stories might be doing the same thing? What about the creation accounts in Genesis 1 or the story of the Tower of Babel? Once you have this key, you start to see that these ancient texts aren't just telling stories, they are making arguments, and that's a whole new way to read them.